We are going to do the same thing that we did this morning, which is ascend those steps. The speakers will ascend those steps in just a few moments. Let me just introduce the speakers very quickly in the order in which they will speak. I'm Tom Aboud, by the way, and the first speaker will be my colleague at Tufts University, Professor Amal Bashara, who's a professor in anthropology, the author of Backstories, U.S. News, and U.S. Yes. And the second speaker will be Annette Beletsky, who's a professor at Quinnipiac, former chair of B'Tselem, human rights organization, an Israeli human rights organization. Rami Khouri will be next. He's an internationally syndicated columnist, editor-in-chief, former editor-in-chief of the Jordan Times. And then finally, Nancy Murray, who is one of the organizers of this conference. And in addition to her many other significant contributions to political activism in this community, she's the co-founder of the Gaza Mental Health Foundation. And so we will now start with the first speaker, Amal Bashara, and she and I will both ascend the steps to the podium.
The microphone's on?
Begin. I have been asked to tell you that that lovely t-shirt worn by Amal is available if you order it through the Alliance for Water Justice website, which is on your materials.
Okay. No, I'm just kidding. Okay.
I'll give you the 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah. You could even give me 5 if you want. Ooh, could I see that? Yeah, that'd be great. Okay. Okay, first of all, I want to begin with a very big thank you to our organizers, especially Elaine Hagopian and Nancy Murray, and also to the entire Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, and to the entire community that comes together for occasions like this to learn and talk together. I'm really grateful to be a part of this excellent activist community. And that's, again, why I'm wearing this fabulous new t-shirt that y'all should pick up. As we know, this is a period of many anniversaries. 50 years of occupation last spring, next spring 70 years of the Nakba. We tend to pay more attention to the anniversary of the Nakba than to Balfour. So why is it then today that it's especially useful for us to look back a bit further in history to consider the consequences of the Balfour Declaration 100 years on? I'm going to try to answer this question. And as I do that, first I'll start off with sort of the direct question that was posed to me about the consequences of Balfour for Palestinians. When I begin thinking about how to approach a question like this, the consequences of Balfour for Palestinians, I remembered a joke that a friend of mine in Ida refugee camp likes to tell. He looks and he says, the first 100 years are difficult, but then it gets a little better. And we see evidence for the first part, but not necessarily for the second at all yet. The first 100 years of Balfour have indeed been terrible for Palestinians. The Palestinian term of the ongoing Nakba, and Nakba al-Mustamirra, captures the extent of ongoing loss of land and rights, the basic ability to grow families and communities that Palestinians face in different ways, whether they are refugees outside of historic Palestine, living under military occupation, or inside Israel. We've seen the destruction of Palestinian industry, the deterioration of Palestinian environments, whether through the degradation of the coastal aquifer under Gaza or through colonial and neoliberal policies that put some of Israel's dirtiest industries and a huge amount of sewage and trash in the West Bank. Many refugees, we know, have faced rounds of war and dispossession that make any semblance of normalcy, and health inconceivable, generations and generations on. Perhaps the biggest tour of Balfour has been fragmentation itself, the fragmentation of Palestinians into refugees outside of historic Palestine, Palestinians under military occupation, and Palestinian citizens of Israel. And of course, these groups have been splintered even more than this, thinking again of the division, for example, of Palestinians in Jerusalem from Palestinians in the rest of the West Bank, and Palestinians in the West Bank from those in Gaza. All of these geographic divisions and differences in political status make it so difficult for Palestinians to do the things that other national groups do, to have a thriving public that revolves around a set of newspapers or television stations or comedy shows or whatever else, to debate so that they can debate and decide the ways in which we will memorialize our past and make decisions about how we want to raise the next generation. Palestinians cannot marry who they like. They cannot move to or within historic Palestine. We are in a constant struggle for and against papers, movement permits, identity cards, passports, travel documents. So in thinking about some of the causes of these issues, I think focusing on the Balfour Declaration allows us to highlight two insidious dynamics: colonialism and a racialized ethno-nationalism. And I know I'm on the right track because I'm kind of following on the themes that other previous speakers today have already, esteemed speakers have already begun to discuss. So the Balfour Declaration was a promise, as many Palestinian commentators have put it this week, from one who did not own Palestine to one who did not deserve it. By 1922, the British authorities had established what they declared was to be a temporary mandate, a form of colonial rule that purported to have the goal of developing people there, but which actually gave the British time to solidify their place in regional geopolitics. Mandate, in general, was not a path to independence, even outside the Palestinian context, but to a new kind of subordination. As international legal scholar Anthony Angi writes, quote, "An examination of the mandate system illuminates the ways in which political sovereignty could be created to be completely consistent with economic subordination," end quote. In Palestine, the British mandate made it possible for the British to help put the Balfour Declaration into effect, since the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the Palestine Mandate's preamble and second article, or I think it's the second article. So, of course, the essence of European colonialism is extraction and also rule by force, contradictorily legitimized by liberal political theorists and imperial civil servants who believed that some peoples were not ready for the rule of law. So it was that the mandate, especially its defense emergency regulations, would rule through repression. These emergency regulations allowed the trial of civilians by military tribunal without the right to appeal. They allowed punitive home demolitions, the administrative detention of people for an indefinite period, and the imposition of closed military zones. All of this should sound pretty familiar to those of us who've been following what's been going on under military occupation for 50 years. After the establishment of the State of Israel, the first Israeli cabinet absorbed those 1945 defense emergency regulations and other elements of British colonial law. Those regulations then became the basis for the Israeli military occupation of areas that Zionist armies conquered that were supposed to be Palestinian according to the UN partition plan. And this military rule lasted for 18 years and had dire consequences on Palestinians who lived under them. In addition to absorbing the British defense emergency regulations, the cabinet also declared a national state of emergency. It was the colonial logic of emergency that then allowed for the new Israeli state to depopulate lands of their Arab inhabitants. In 1967, these same British emergency laws became the basis for a new military occupation over the West Bank and Gaza. So administrative detention, home demolitions, and so forth have all continued. Even in its 1948 territories, Israel has never ended that state of emergency, though its use of this element of the non-legal system has fluctuated. This rule from outside the law was recently, for example, the basis for the declaration of the Islamic movement as illegal in Israel in 2015. And it's striking that even with all the laws that Israel has in place, anti-terror, anti-incitement laws, that they resorted to those British colonial laws because they could be even more repressive in outlawing a movement purely for political purposes. Of course, it's not only a text of its laws that we find the colonial logics of rule. Israel is a settler colonial state that continues to push Palestinians off their land. We see this especially in Israeli attempts to displace Bedouin, often multiple times, from the lands on which they live. I'm going to try to move through some of this. And we see this in the rhetorics with which they displace people. So in the case of the village of al-Hayran, whose residents will be displaced from their village to make way for the Jewish town of Hayran, we see an Israeli co-optation of Palestinian presence through its naming practices, and at the same time, a racist determination that those Palestinians wouldn't be suitable to live in the new Jewish town of Hayran. So Balfour, in that sense, trains our attention to Zionism as a colonial project that built on previous British colonial projects. The second other key and other related legacy of the Balfour Declaration that I want to highlight today is that promotes an ethno-nationalist supremacist state in Palestine. Though Jews made up only a tiny percentage of the population at the time of the Balfour Declaration, of course, they were promised British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. Palestinians did not even warrant recognition in the document, and they were referred to instead as existing non-Jewish communities. And this exclusivist logic was recognized from the start, including by some Sephardic Jews, who noted that basically this kind of exclusivist logic was going to also dispossess them of their sort of relationship to the land in its own specific ways. Writing, for example, Haim Ben Kiki wrote in the years after Balfour, the Sephardic community came from eastern lands to an eastern land, and our soul has been intertwined for generations with the Arab people. So the Balfour Declaration undermines some of that connection. The legacy of the erasure of Palestinian identity has continued under the Israeli state, which categorizes Palestinians in Israel as being Christians, Muslims, or Druze, as being non-Jews, sometimes Arabs, but never as Palestinians. Aside from issues of naming, the Israeli state has refused to recognize collective Palestinian rights, at times using the granting of individual civil liberties as a way to undermine collective identities. Thankfully, as Palestinian scholars like Nadim Rahana, Arij Sabah Khouri, and others have pointed out, in recent years, Palestinians have mobilized to reassert their collective rights within Israel. Still, though, Israel has a system of more than 50 laws that discriminate against Palestinians on a wide variety of topics. And we can see, again, sort of the entrenchment of this ethno-nationalist supremacist logic in Israel today in, for example, the Jewish nation-state bill, which is currently under consideration but has the strong support of Netanyahu, which would further solidify the state's Jewish characteristics at the expense of its democratic ones. For example, it would demote Arabic from being an official language of the state. Another bill under consideration with Netanyahu's support is the Muazzin bill, which would categorize the Muslim call to prayer as unreasonable noise. Again, an attempt to erase Palestinian presence, unreasonable noise in particular for the dawn prayer. Of course, when a state promotes an atmosphere of ethnic or racial hierarchy, racist elements in society are only strengthened. We see that here today, unfortunately. So we see settler violence, including against Palestinian children in the West Bank. We see, mob violence on the rise in Jerusalem. And of course, Israel's military violence against Palestinians in Gaza and its ferocious siege and wars against Palestinians in Gaza is underwritten by racism too, by that fundamental dismissal of the value of Palestinian lives. So I want to save a little time to talk about where do we go from here. One thing that Balfour does is it also pushes back our timeline for when Palestinians started their struggle against European colonialism. Palestinians have been resisting European-style settler colonialism for 100 years. In resisting the British mandate, Palestinians were an important part of a global movement against empire. I think, our current crisis in Palestinian leadership should cause us to perhaps both think big and think small, to think creatively about what liberation would or should mean, perhaps beyond ideas of statehood. We can think alongside scholars of indigeneity and colonialism who remind us that the nation-state system is always inclined to reinforce the power of the powerful and to disempower smaller states whose sovereignty will always be compromised. So what can we do? We can work to forge connections with each other and I'm thinking here of especially Palestinians and Palestinians in diaspora, but also Palestinians and their supporters, but Palestinians through the arts and new media technologies. Palestinians today are living vastly different lives from each other in a variety of political systems that are naturally difficult to understand from the outside. So we need to have difficult conversations about what divides us, but also about how to best take advantages of the positions we each hold. Can Palestinians build platforms outside of the restrictive and problematic dominant forms of social media like Facebook, which are inclined to surveillance, and so forth, to promote conversation about Palestinians' different lives and challenges. We see, for example, the digital rights organization Hamla, which is based in Haifa, doing important work to teach people about digital rights. That's a good start. Where else can we take that? Second, the Palestinian Authority, of course, is a corrupt and a minimalist model for sovereignty. But I think even in the best case, a Palestinian sovereignty would not be robust without thriving connections to a liberated Arab world, with connections forged not only on the basis of shared Arab and Muslim histories, but also on the basis of Middle Eastern diversities. So we should think about how to build those connections too. Third, many Palestinians, as well as Palestinian and Israeli anti-Zionist organizations, I'm thinking of Badil, Zochrot, are practicing return, even under the dire restrictions Palestinians face today. They're conducting village tours in places like Al-Qabu to keep Palestinian history alive and present in villages whose lands have been colonized. In the Galilee villages of Iqrit and Ber'am, from which many Palestinians were internally displaced, so they are displaced from the lands but living inside Israel, they can return to their villages in summer camps or to set up and maintain residency against military orders, and that is a powerful way of affirming Palestinian rights and presence. Fourth, Palestinians can work to restore their environments and keep Palestinian agriculture alive. And they're doing that in a variety of ways in a lot of different places. And I know you have a workshop later that can talk more about that, and I'm going to move through a little bit. Fifth, we need to work to advance the rights and enrich the life possibilities of women and sexual minorities who have been deeply impacted also by Israeli settler colonialism and violence. As scholars such as Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian and Sarah Ahmoud and others have analyzed, feminist perspectives can point the way for a real liberation for all of us. Honoring women's and men's stories of resistance and return and the significance of the Palestinian home is an important step on every step of this journey. Sixth, and finally for now, Palestinians need to find ways to build robust solidarity with others affected by settler colonialism, racism, militarism, and mass incarceration. Not only are we more powerful when we work together to make these connections, but we have much to learn from other movements, even though it's certainly true that the tactics of one site do not always translate to Palestine. These, of course, are just a few ideas to which we can all add as Palestinians and as allies. Just as the Nakba is ongoing, so is our struggle for liberation. Just as Patrick Wolf put it, settler colonialism is a structure and not an event, so will our liberation be a long process, and we must continue the work each day. Thank you all.
Oh, there you are.
Thank you to Nancy, thank you to Elaine, thank you to all of you, and thank you especially for having me here. I'm an Israeli Jew. It's also hard to be number 4 or 5. I love being the first speaker because the minute I am anything but the first speaker, I feel that I have to relate to and engage with and answer and ask more questions, especially, and this will come out, things that Susan said that are so relevant to what I want to say. So let me begin, and where I go off to just look at you, Susan, you'll understand what I'm doing. In his op-ed on October 28th this year, titled "Balfour's Original Sin," Gideon Levy wrote, this is quoting him now, "There was never anything like it, an empire promising a land that it had not yet conquered to a people not living there without asking the inhabitants." And I said to myself, what else can I say if I'm supposed to talk about the consequences for Israel and the Jewish people? I think Gideon said it in one sentence. And then last week, there was an event at Harvard on November 5th and 6th, run by the Center for Jewish Studies at Harvard. It hosted about 20 people. I'm not being racist here, saying that I think 19 of them were Jewish. The name of the conference was the Balfour Declaration in Jewish History, and I thought to myself, oh my God. The Balfour Declaration is now a point of Jewish history, and is that all we want to say? can we really talk about the Balfour Declaration as a point of Jewish history, given everything that we have heard before, given everything that we know? So Gidon sort of evened out the Harvard conference, and I decided to think about the consequences for Israel and the Jews. These are interesting ways of putting it. Is it Israel or is it Zionism when we talk about the consequences, as we've heard before? Is it the Jews, the Jewish people, Judaism, Jewishness? What exactly are we talking about when we say consequences for the Jews, as it says in the title here? I will try to tell you about things that have happened in Israel and for the Jews that most of you obviously know about. But what I will try to do is talk about the common wisdom and the way people treat the Balfour Declaration, the cliches, the mantras, the way we in Israel or Jews in America have been brought up to think of the Balfour Declaration, and how different that is from things that we know, even things that we've heard this morning. So in 1917, Balfour wrote those words, and I repeat them again: a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Every word there is important. A national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And he also wrote, and some say, in Israel of course, that he had the decency to write. I stand with those who decry the negatively nuanced addition here, quote, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. So the common wisdom in Israel, and we hear this all the time, I think we hear it also in most Jewish communities all over the world, is that the Balfour Declaration legitimized or endorsed, those are the words that we hear, legitimized or endorsed the idea of a nation state for the Jewish people. And what does that mean? That constitutes sovereignty, land, and military. I always think of the fact, and I'm thinking here of Danny Boyarin, who says the whole point of Jewish culture in Europe was that we didn't have sovereignty, land, or military. That's what made Jewishness so great. You didn't need sovereignty or land or a military to have a great Jewish culture, and that again corresponds with what we were talking about culture before. So I wonder, how is it that that has become such common wisdom, that Balfour endorsed or legitimized, as if there was an idea already and he was the one endorsing it. He was legitimizing that idea. And yes, that idea was surfacing, definitely since Zionism came out explicitly, but still, how could that be so different from the legal concepts that we know? How could it be so different from both international and domestic law in so many places? How could it be so different even from historical fact? When we do political science, I think we spend much more time than we had this morning about the concept of a nation. When I teach human rights law, I always think about that right to a nationality, and I always wonder, why did they say nationality rather than citizenship? So we heard from Susan how these things are so clearly defined and determined in law, but they are not in the way that people speak in ordinary language. The concept of nation, the concept of people, are the two concepts that Zionism and the Jews in Israel, not so much outside of Israel, but in Israel, nation and people are the two concepts that trouble anyone who thinks there is moral or political trouble here. There's also state, religion, and race, and I'll bring that up in a minute. But nation and people. Balfour said, national home for the Jewish people. There's nation in there, and there's people in there. And that is what created, more than endorsed and more than legitimized, that feeling of surety, of certainty, that we are a nation and a people. We had that, I have the Hebrew word gushbanka, but that is the approval, the final approval for that type of entity for the Jews, being not just a culture, a religion, but actually a people and a nation, and getting that approval from the empire, of course. I'm going to rush over. I'm not going to talk about what Zionism in general said about those things, but I think it's been mentioned here without the name yet. Brit Shalom, which was one branch of Zionism. They thought of themselves as Zionists. That's Buber, etc., that whole famous list of people. They thought they were Zionists, but they didn't think that had anything to do with a sovereign state. They thought they were even willing to go with nation and people. But it was a cultural aspect rather than any kind of legal or political thing. And that's how we bring them up now every time we talk about the one-state solution. So I'll talk about that later, perhaps, if we have time. It's by looking at the protesters against the Balfour Declaration that I can now pinpoint the consequences for Israel and the Jews. There's an amazing text from 1919 that was written by, I think, 28 or 30 American Jews. Famous names there. Some diplomats, Morgenthau, who was father of R. Morgenthau, I think, of the political science guy. He had been ambassador to Turkey, if I'm not mistaken. 1919, they wrote a letter to Wilson just before he went to the peace conference, post-World War I peace conference. And they said they want to explain to him why the idea of a Jewish state is misguided and worse. These were American Jews writing Wilson why there shouldn't be a Jewish state. Now note, they say, quote, "At the outset we wish to indicate our entire sympathy with the efforts of Zionists which aim to secure for Jews at present living in lands of oppression a refuge in Palestine or elsewhere where they may freely develop their capabilities and carry on their activities as free citizens." So that kind of Zionism was okay, to have a refuge in Palestine or elsewhere for Jews suffering from oppression. But then they explicitly go on to tell us that that has nothing to do with a Jewish state. Regarding Israel, and they're going to say one thing about Israel, two things actually about Israel, and one thing about the Jews, and that is absolutely fascinating. 1919, regarding Israel, quote, "Whether the Jews be regarded as a race or as a religion, it is contrary to democratic principles for which the world war was waged to found a nation on either or both of these bases. A Jewish state involves fundamental limitations as to race and religion, else the term Jewish means nothing." And they go on to say, "To unite church and state in any form would be a leap backward of 2,000 years. That's about Israel. About the Jews, they say, quote, "The Balfour Declaration to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine means a home for Jews universally. No Jew, wherever he may live, can consider himself free from the implications of such a grant. We object because the Jews are dedicated heart and soul to the welfare of the countries in which they dwell under free conditions. All Jews repudiate every suspicion of a double allegiance, but to our minds it is necessarily implied in and cannot by any logic be eliminated from the establishment of a sovereign state for the Jews in Palestine." So there you have it all. There you have what happened to Israel and what happened to the Jews, where in 1919 some wise Jews saw that this would happen. This is exactly the consequences of the Balfour Declaration. For Israel, the Balfour Declaration meant two horrific conclusions. The Jewish state could not be democratic because of its Jewish exclusivity, and the Jewish state, based on its religious identification, not to mention its justification, of course, by religious texts and promises, could not abide by the democratic principle of separation and religion of state. So there's two things here. There's the discrimination, and there's the church and state. Discrimination according to church, synagogue, and then melding those together. For Jews everywhere, the Jewish state could not but create a double loyalty and a confusion of identities, especially for people who were dedicated to social justice. There was an amazing publication here in America that started in 1948, edited by William Zuckerman, spelled just with a K, not C-K, Zuckerman. It was called the Jewish Newsletter. He died in 1961, and then it went out of print completely. It was an anti-Zionist Jewish publication. Beautiful. If you open up the book today of those articles, it sounds exactly like the conversations we're having right now. All right? So these were Jewish anti-Zionists. They were in a minority, as were the people who wrote Wilson. They wrote Wilson that letter. Wilson doesn't even refer to it. We have the letter. We don't have anything by Wilson. All right, so Balfour didn't legitimize the idea of a nation state. He literally articulated it and did so formally with the blessing of the empire. And thus he is considered, and rightly so by Israelis, the father of an international recognition of Jewish sovereignty in the state of Israel. And now we want to take one further step. So we've got Israel not being democratic, we've got American Jews being conflicted, and a further step, and that is, of course, colonialism. Interestingly, the opposition to the Declaration, which mentioned colonialism, came from different but very understandable quarters. While the American Jews saw the problem of the Jewish state as thwarting democracy, it was a few Mizrahi Jews in Palestine, and we've mentioned this here as well, seeing the asymmetry that's articulated in the Declaration between Jews and Palestinians, but they were the ones who were opposing it. And they were the ones who brought up colonialism. Just recently, we've unearthed a few papers written by Mizrahi Jews, again, in the 20s, 1921, 1924. The two names that come to mind are Yosef Kastel and Chaim Ben Kiki. Very interesting. I mean, they do come up in Israeli history here and there and other things. But they, again, spoke out against the Balfour Declaration. Think of this. This was already almost 5 years after the Balfour Declaration, but they're dealing with it. Kastel says, and this is interesting, they mention two different things, but they both come from the same root. Kastel says that we need to develop the other inhabitants, and the other inhabitants are the Palestinian, what he is calling Arabs, the other inhabitants' current national home. So he's taking that concept, national home, and he's saying they have a national home as well and uphold their legal rights over the land. So they're seeing this already then as a legal thing. In other words, unlike the Zionists, he thought Arabs had national rights to the land and looked at the practical feasibility of living together on the same land. Ben Kiki, who is speaking explicitly from the Mizrahi perspective, viewed the Balfour Declaration as a colonialist project. And he uses those words. He viewed the Balfour Declaration as a colonialist project that undermines, with its European interests and culture, the cooperation and mutual cultural intertwining between Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians. And you read it again today, it sounds like I would have him give a course, in anthropology on post-colonialism, because he's talking about the place where Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians have so much together because of their North African and Middle Eastern roots. This is colonialism voiced, or anti-colonialism voiced in the words of the local who's coming out against Ashkenazi European colonialism. All right, so 3 things then. Israel is not going to be democratic for 2 reasons: discrimination in church and state. Jews are going to be conflicted, and worst of all, Israel is going to be a colonialist state. Not very many people spoke that way then. I think we all know that now. So as Gidon says, not only did Balfour establish the idea of a Jewish national state, he also bequeathed us the idea of a colonial state. This is because Balfour did not say 2 states, he said 1 Jewish state with civil and religious rights for the others. concrete consequences rather than ideological ones? Well, every town in Israel has a street named Balfour. The Prime Minister's home is on Balfour Street. And we always think of that, or probably we don't always think of that. High schools are called Balfour. We teach Balfour. I've had a lot of conversations this past week with Israelis. Most of them tell me that they never taught us much about the Balfour Declaration. I do remember 1897, beginning of Zionism, 1917, Balfour, 1947, Kaftet B'November is the UN partition plan. Those are the three pre-state dates that you do learn. So I am thinking about Balfour as a historical effect that has had such deep consequences. He is always celebrated. That conference in Harvard was a celebration. There was a tiny bit of internal criticism from the Mizrahi side, but it was a celebration. For Israelis, it's a celebration. It's a celebration that we are not democratic. It's a celebration that we have the Jews with us, whether conflicted or not, and it's a celebration that we are such successful colonialists. I can only end by saying there's not one song about Balfour. Thank you.
Give me a 2-minute signal. Thank you very much to all the organizers and sponsors and volunteers who put this together, and all of you who've attended. It's an honor and a great pleasure for me to be here and share some thoughts with you. But mostly it's inspiring to see the continued dynamism of people of justice and ethics and fairness in the United States from all quarters of life to get together and to continue this struggle which has been going on for many years. And appropriately, the Balfour Declaration is a mechanism that we can use to analyze all of the dimensions of this conflict. And you know, some people accuse us of going back to the past, and they say, why do you keep thinking of the past? Why don't you just look to the future? And the answer to that is because the past hasn't ended. The past is still dynamic. The dynamics of the past are still governing our lives and plaguing many aspects of our lives. And I'll give you just one fascinating little personal anecdote. When my first son was born on July 24, 1980, when my father came to the hospital, we're Palestinians from Nazareth, and when my father came to the hospital, he said, my saloon day. I said, what the hell's my saloon day? He said, your son was born on my saloon day. And I asked him to explain that to me. I'm not a student of history. And he said, my saloon day was, of course, a historic battle west of Damascus on July 24, 1920, when a group of Syrian nationalists went out to confront the French army that was coming in. And of course, they were badly defeated because of the power of the French, and they lost, and the French went in to take Damascus, overthrew the budding young Arab-Syrian kingdom, it was called then. And then history played itself out. But the anecdote is important because it tells us that these episodes resonate in people's lives. My father was not born in 1920, he was born in the 1930s, but these things are living memories from historical markers that still shape our lives and in many cases plague our lives. And the Balfour Declaration in its core elements, for me, captures all of the negative dynamics and values that pertained back there in 1917, back then, but still pertain today. And these are essential. I'm not going to go over them because you've heard them in other things, but it's the basic idea that foreign powers, imperial or colonial or just strong, active, dynamic foreign powers, can intervene in our region, do what they want, manipulate our land, our people, our identities, the names of our countries, the borders. They can do anything they want, that we don't matter. The indigenous people don't matter. We have no rights. We have no voice. We have no claims to anything in the face of this imperial power. We're invisible people, and we don't exist. And the foreign powers can do anything they want in our land to serve their interests, or the interests of people that they want to help, in this case the Jewish people or the Zionists, who they wanted to help, but who also they exploited for various reasons. So, for their purposes, for the Western imperial purposes, that fundamental dynamic that we don't count, foreign power dominates everything and does whatever it wants in our region, is still the defining dynamic of political actions by Zionism and the Israeli state, and by foreign powers as well. So when we see Nikki Haley say that she will never allow a Palestinian to have a senior post at the United Nations, this is quite extraordinary, but it's not new. This is the living reconfiguration of the dynamics of Balfour. When the US announces it's going to leave UNESCO, this is the living reaffirmation of the Balfour Declaration dynamics in action, and it goes on and on and on. So these things are important to keep in mind, and the points that I want to make quickly in my comments are about how the Balfour Declaration has impacted the Arab world, and it has impacted the Arab world and beyond the Arab world in the Middle East. When you look at Turkey and Iran and other places, it has impacted the Middle East in many ways, most of them negative, virtually all of them negative, and it still continues to impact much of our region and our people in negative ways. And historically going through them, I would say the earliest negative impact that permeates the Arab world and still plagues us today is the way that the Balfour Declaration, the birth of Zionism, the creation of the State of Israel, which is really one dynamic, you can't separate them. So when I say Balfour Declaration, I'm talking about Zionism, I'm talking about the creation and expansion of the State of Israel and its consolidation. The single biggest impact, I believe, historically in the Arab world of the Balfour Declaration has been to elicit from within the Arab world a tradition that has been the single most destructive force in our lives in the Arab region and continues until this day. And the Israelis are still active in this. And this single most destructive force is the tradition of military men taking power in Arab countries. It started in the 40s, a little bit in the 30s in Iraq, and in the 40s a little bit in Syria, but it was really 1952 when Nasser in Egypt, and then it spread to other countries, where military men took power by force, executive power, and then they controlled the judiciary, the legislatures, the army, the economy, and the information systems. They controlled all power in Arab countries totally. And they ran these Arab countries into the ground over the next 50 years. And you see the consequences today, these wrecks of countries, these fragmented countries, these shattered countries, these countries at war with themselves, these countries that generate savagery in the form of terrorist movements and radical movements that chop people's heads off, and massive refugee flows, displaced people, entire cities displaced. This is the legacy of Arab military rule nonstop since the early 1950s, and it spread after that, of course, to Libya with Gaddafi, to Iraq with Saddam Hussein, to Syria with the Assads who are still there, to Zain al-Abidin bin Ali, Ali Abdullah Saleh, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. You rattle these names off like a string of rogues, a rogues gallery of Arab military leaders who had total power and who were totally incompetent in managing their countries. And that legacy is still active today. You see it in Egypt. And the latest manifestation of this, and this is where, again, we see the the reincarnation of the fundamental dynamics of Balfourism, which is in Saudi Arabia now. The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, in the last 2 weeks, basically, has brought into his hands military power, economic power, political power, religious power, cultural power, and media power. We now have one man in Saudi Arabia. He happens to be a very dynamic and very young and totally inexperienced young man, which is typical in the Arab tradition, unfortunately. But this man now has almost total power to do anything he wants. And if history is any kind of guide, he's going to drive Saudi Arabia into the ground or create tensions. We'll see. I hope he doesn't. I hope that he does well and people help him and he sees the light and he turns out to be a great national leader. But I kind of doubt it, because as we see in all these other cases where power was concentrated in the hands of individual people in Arab countries, we've had train wrecks and massive catastrophes and massive human displacement and suffering, dealing in the hundreds of millions of people across our region. And we can trace this tradition back to the impact of Balfour and Zionism in the 1940s to Arab officers who felt that they had to take control because only they could protect our countries from the threat of Zionism. That was the excuse they used, but they proved totally incompetent at both pushing back against Zionism or developing the potential of our Arab countries. This led to decades and decades, 50, 60, 70 years of incredible waste of money and human resources and time, and we see it again all around the region today. The continuous cumulative inability of the Arabs to meet the Israelis head-on militarily in 1948 and 56, 67, 73, in other wars, this created another negative impact across the region, which was the growing sense among many, many people in the Arab world, not all of them, but I would say clearly a majority, who had lost confidence in both the efficacy and the legitimacy of their own governments. And this was an important element that fed into the uprisings in 2010, 2011. It wasn't the main element, but it was there in the foundation of the sense among millions and millions of Arab citizens that their governments were not serving them, that their governments were tormenting them and humiliating them. And what people were asking for when they rose up was the antidote to humiliation, which was dignity and the social justice. And part of the reason for this is the sense that these governments were totally incompetent and unjust in dealing with their people and unable to do anything about the threat of Israel. Also, this situation of Balfour and Zionism and Israel created a situation which we also see today, and again, Mohammed bin Salman and others in the Gulf, where Arab elites and Arab citizens at the community level became separated, where elites went for certain national goals, usually pandering to the desires and interests of Western imperial powers, in some cases Eastern powers, maybe Iran, maybe Russia, maybe Turkey, maybe China soon, but pandering to foreign powers as interests more than the rights of their own people. So the split between the populations in the Arab countries and the elites started way back then, and we've seen this recurring over the years, where Arab governments would do what they thought the Americans and the Israelis or the British would like, and they did that, and it created more and more tension in Arab countries. And we see it today with the Saudis and others in the Gulf thinking about how can we have normal relations with Israel without really solving the problem of Palestine equitably for Israelis and Palestinians. We must repeat continuously that we're prepared for a noble, honest, just peace that gives Israelis and Palestinians their national rights, security, recognition, and human dignity. We're not talking anymore, as people did in the 50s, about throwing Israel into the sea, which was only used once or twice. But the point is we acknowledge the legitimacy of a Jewish majority Israeli state. We didn't before, but we do now. It's official Arab policy. But Arab leaders are still looking to the power of Israel, the power of the United States and others to protect them from the troubles that they have at home or in the region. In some cases, Arabs have trouble, say, with Iran, and they think that the West can protect them. They have trouble with dynamic Islamist activists or others. But again, we can trace that split of elites and people back to the impact of Balfour and the creation of the State of Israel. Another thing that the Balfour Israel legacy created were these militant Islamist movements. Groups like Hamas and Hezbollah that came into being in the early 1980s, essentially. They didn't exist before. We had mild Islamists, we had Muslim Brothers, we had mainstream nonviolent Islamist groups, which were perfectly legitimate and exist in all societies. But we didn't have militant resistance groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, and these have become now major players in the region. They have created major new tensions with Israel and with the West, and with Arab countries, to the point now where the Saudi Emirati blockade of Qatar, one of the things they're demanding is to cut ties with Hamas and Islamist movements like that, and the recent Lebanese-Saudi tensions of the last week are focused very much on Hezbollah. Linked to that is the other problem that the Zionism has created recently, which is tensions beyond the Arab world with Iran and with Turkey, which have over the years had cold and hot relations with Israel. Back in the days of the Shah, the Israelis and the Iranians were very close, sharing security and oil and all kinds of other things. And then it changed after the revolution. And in the Turkish case, again, Turkey had bad relations, good relations, then bad relations, then good relations, and now they're somewhere in between. So the rippling consequences of the Balfour Declaration, the State of Israel, and the impact on the region, the Arab world and beyond, continue to be manifested in so many different ways, politically, strategically, and militarily. Another impact of the Balfour Declaration was to validate the idea of an ethnic state, which Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and the Islamic State thought was a great idea, and then so we've had the Islamic State announced, and then it was pushed back, and now we'll see what happens next. But to validate the idea of a small ethnic state is something relatively new in the region, because most of the states of the region and the societies of the region were very multinational and pluralistic. Another problem that we have is the humiliation continuing until this day, we still see it, of Arab countries that are trying to buy technology or military equipment from Western sources, especially the United States or England, and they can't buy it unless the Israelis give their approval. So that Arab well-being, as defined by the Arab countries, whatever it is, they want to buy a computer system or an F-35 jet or whatever it is, the Israelis have to say okay, and if the Israelis say no, we can't have it. So again, this is incredibly humiliating and leads to continued erosion in the sense of ordinary Arab citizens that their governments are actually legitimate governments that are looking out for their best interests, and they sense that their governments are basically doing whatever they're allowed to do by the Israelis and the United States. So those are some of the main points that really I would point out are the ways that Balfour and Zionism in Israel have rippled across the Arab world. And the most important point, finally, in the end, is that these problems continue, that the Balfour principles and the policies of Zionism and the practices of the State of Israel are very much continuing in colonization, in expulsions, in mass incarcerations, in assassinations, in denials of rights, and they've now reached your country here in the United States, where they're trying to pass legislation which prevents criticizing Israel, which you will hear about in the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about consequences for the USA. There's no time here to describe the tension in 20th century US policymaking circles about whether the Balfour Declaration and the emergence of the State of Israel served or impeded U.S. oil interests in the Middle East. This is the subject of lots of books, and I recommend one by Irene Genzier, Dying to Forget. In the decades following Israel's rout of Arab armies in the Six-Day War, the notion that it was an essential Cold War ally and barrier to the spread of Arab nationalism held increasing sway. And now in the 21st century, we see a convergence of interests tied to a never-ending war on terror through a massive web of military, security, and technological connections that bind the U.S. and Israel together in what has become an almost symbiotic embrace. An article in the Israeli paper Haaretz in January 2015 sheds light on this convergence of interest while suggesting that Israel is no mere client state. Amir Oren is writing in January 2015 about a visit by 9 Israeli colonels to Fort Benning, Georgia, following Israel's summer 2014 offensive in Gaza. Quote, they gave a 3-day joint workshop on the lessons learned from Operation Protective Edge, particularly on tunnel warfare. Oren then adds, quote, not all the secrets were revealed to their hosts. He goes on, only a week after Protective Edge had ended, he writes, the Pentagon's Joint Chiefs of Staff hastened to fly a team to Israel, and General Martin Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, publicly absolved the IDF of war crimes, saying Israel had gone to extraordinary lengths to limit civilian casualties, end quote. You will recall what Operation Protective Edge was. A massive loss of life and devastation was inflicted by air, ground, and naval assault on the tiny Gaza Strip. But this was of little concern to a superpower with more than 1,000 military bases and installations in at least 125 countries, which gives Israel more military aid each year than it gives to all the other countries combined. In return, Israel is expected to do its part for the hegemonic power. But Israel, which has long been classified as the, quote, most militarized nation in the world, end quote, by the Global Militarization Index, has priorities of its own, including its own robust arms trade with 130 countries. Documents leaked by Edward Snowden reveal that its spying on and within the U.S. is a major concern, quote, despite inarguable ties between the U.S. and its closest ally in the Middle East, Adam Goldman and Matt Apuzzo wrote for the Associated Press in 2012, quote, and despite statements from U.S. politicians trumpeting this friendship, U.S. national security officials consider Israel to be at times a frustrating ally and a genuine counterintelligence threat, end quote. Of course, this is not how Israel is presented by supporters who trumpet the, quote, shared values that tie the nations together. On its website, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, states that, quote, the commitment to democracy, the rule of law, freedom of religion and speech, and human rights are all core values shared between the U.S. and Israel, end quote. Now, there are other shared values that never get mentioned, but which I would maintain provide the U.S.-Israel relationship with its bedrock foundation. These relate to the settler colonialism that in the 17th to the 19th centuries powered the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous inhabitants of what became the continental United States, and which in the century since the Balfour Declaration has steadily dispossessed the indigenous population of Palestine. Common to both colonizing projects has been a sense of racial superiority and divine entitlement, an expansionist vision, and ready resort to the tools of extreme dehumanization and militarized violence. Roseanne Dunbar Ortiz's book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, at times sounds like an indigenous people's history of Palestine. In the time remaining, I want to touch briefly on 5 consequences set in motion by the Balfour Declaration, which have had a significant impact on the United States, both domestically and internationally. First is what can be called the political sacred cow syndrome, with a shared values mantra taking the place of forthright discussion where Israel is concerned. Israel, of course, is not the only sacred cow. The G word, 4-letter word, guns, is another one. But still, seeing the entire Congress rise as one from their seats 29 times during Netanyahu's speech on May 24th, 2011, was like watching a choreographed adulatory ritual. It is striking that the more than $125 billion given to Israel since 1949, these are Congressional Research Service figures, that amount of money has rarely been brought up for critical debate. Outside of Congress, a Palestinian exception to the First Amendment has been carved out through intimidation techniques honed by well-funded pro-Israel support groups with Mark McCarthyite tendencies. The mainstream media has not been spared and has, either as a result of pressure or preference, resorted to the self-censorship vividly illustrated in the film The Occupation of the American Mind. And putting Israel beyond the reach of well-informed discussion is hardly conducive to sound decision-making. So that's consequence 1. 2, second consequence is the emergence of a conglomeration of organizations to tend to the sacred cow, the many-tentacled lobby with AIPAC at its center. Its electoral clout is provided by Christian Zionism, which the Reverend Jerry Falwell claimed had 70 million adherents eager to see Israel expand throughout its biblical territory in order to hasten the second coming of Christ. In Falwell's words, quote, "Nothing would bring the wrath of the Christian people, the Christian public, down on this government like abandoning or opposing Israel in a critical matter," end quote. The lobby, of course, has a commanding presence in Congress, in state legislatures, and local municipalities. Now, thanks to lobby pressure and the Israeli government's allocation of at least $32 million last year to defeat the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions Movement, or BDS, 21 states have passed laws or executive orders opposing BDS. The Congressional Anti-Boycott Act of 2017 that threatens BDS supporters with million-dollar fines and up to 20 years in prison has hundreds of co-sponsors. You could hear more about this at a workshop this afternoon. What most distinguishes the pro-Israel lobby is not so much the amount of money it spends. The health industry, for instance, apparently spent $500 million lobbying in 2016. So it's not so much the money, but it's the fact that it basically serves the interests of a foreign country and enables secretive foreign intervention in matters of democratic debate. Since its funding in 1959, AIPAC has evaded the oversight of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Whatever your stance on BDS, we should all be troubled by the October revelation that Israel is funneling large sums to a powerful Chicago-based law firm to fight BDS, presumably by bringing lawsuits against BDS supporters. 3, a third consequence concerns Israel's role in the massive violation of Americans' privacy rights. Among documents leaked by Snowden is a memorandum of understanding between the NSA and Israeli intelligence, under which the NSA would provide raw intelligence to Israel, including on American citizens. Another provides information about the NSA's PRISM program, in which 2 Israeli-linked high-tech companies, Narus and Verint, intercept our online and telecom communications for the NSA. The data they gather can reportedly be accessed remotely by Israeli intelligence officials, agencies. A June 10, 2013 article in Haaretz headlined, quote, "In U.S. snooping affair, Israel firms at risk," that's the headline, describe the ties that these firms have with the IDF's secret intelligence gathering Unit 8200. Another Israeli firm, Amdocs, gathers metadata from U.S. call and billing records, including those of major telecoms and the White House and FBI. Fourth consequence concerns those most at risk from such domestic spying: Arab Americans and Muslims, who have in the U.S. been racialized as a suspicious other for nearly 50 years. In the Nixon era, Operation Boulder ethnically profiled Arabs, with the FBI receiving information about Palestinians directly from Israeli intelligence. By the 1980s, AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, and other groups were compiling files on Arab Americans in an effort to silence them and demonize them as terrorists. In the 1990s, Arabs and Muslims, many of them Palestinian, were exclusively targeted for indefinite detention through the use of secret evidence alleging they were national security risks. No terrorism charges were ever brought against them. And after the attacks of 9/11, you will recall that racial and religious profiling led to massive arrests of Muslims and Arabs. The media was dominated by anti-Palestinian terrorism experts like Steve Emerson and Daniel Pipes, who depicted the Palestinian struggle as a global jihad front. By this time, Israel was being presented as an indispensable ally in the war against terrorism, since hadn't it been fighting terrorism for over 50 years? Methods deployed against Arab Americans and Muslims have undermined not just the First Amendment, but some other constitutional guarantees with implications for everybody. One example is the use in U.S. courts of disguised Israeli agents testifying from behind screens and using code names, a clear violation of the Sixth Amendment right of the accused, quote, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, end quote. And the fifth consequence, you've already heard from a bit from Susan, it is the impact of the U.S. relationship on the functioning of international law. Protected by the U.S., Israel has violated nearly every article of the U.S. Universal Declaration of Human Rights and ignored hundreds of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions. And one wonders how the U.S. can expect to promote itself to the world as a champion of human rights when it has done so much to undermine the functioning of the UN and the framework of international legality. Since 9/11, U.S. troops have trained in Israel in urban counterinsurgency and made ample use of methods that have long been part of the Israeli arsenal against Palestinians: indefinite detention, extraordinary rendition, so-called extrajudicial killings, and forms of torture that have long been routinely practiced in Israel. Both countries have crafted elaborate legal arguments to shore up profoundly illegal practices. Both have set aside the Geneva Conventions, called quaint by former U.S. Attorney General Alberto Gonzales, and behaved as if certain categories of human beings do not deserve human rights. And both claim to be acting in self-defense as they unleash their military might and kill with impunity. And what is striking about the forever wars in which the U.S. is now engaged and Israel's forever conflict with the Palestinian population is the shared refusal to examine root causes. What is much more lucrative is dehumanizing the enemy, keeping the home front fearful by incessantly banging the drum of terrorism. And I urge you to read Jeff Halper's book, War Against the People, that documents Israel's rise to the top of the securitization industry and its pioneering methods of social control that have been exported to the U.S. and around the world. What other country can offer such extensive war on terror know-how, as well as security technologies and weapons that are, in Halper's words, quote, the products of continuous engagement in real life, on-the-ground laboratory of the occupied Palestinian territory, end quote. Let me conclude on this Veterans Day by saying how critically important it is to curb the military aggression that has defined and deformed both the United States and Israel from its earliest days. The work to undo white supremacy and the legacy of settler colonialism in the United States is of a piece with the work to usher in freedom, justice, and equality for the Palestinian people, and in so doing, we have a better world to win. Thank you.
4 wonderful presentations. Thank you so much to the panelists. And I think because we are running a little bit behind, we'll try to do the question and answer session as quickly as we can, but we don't want to colonize the lunch period, but we do want to maybe move toward lunch in the next 15 minutes, although I'll take direction on that. But why don't we do this then? Why don't we have 3 crisp questions, and then the panelists will field them. We'll get 3 people in first, and then we'll do a second round if we have the time. So please line up here, and then we will hear your question. And please make it a question, as Hillary so poetically said this morning.
Everybody, I'm very happy to hear everybody. But there's one thing about Maysalun, and the fact that at the time of Maysalun, the defense minister was Yusuf al-Admi, and he actually himself was killed against General Goro, and General Goro saluted him when he came, they took over Syria at that time. So, as opposed to the Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, who was the defense minister and gave Israel the Golan Heights. So it's actually what he said, and I have lived it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the panelists for a very informative session here. I'm going to hearken back to a class in Middle East history at Tufts too many decades ago that I should mention, but on the Balfour Declaration, the perspective that it was taught then was also in the context of the Hussein-McMahon agreements and the Sykes-Picot, not as sort of an intentional expansion of colonialism, but as really expeditious means in England of whether it was to gain allegiances against the enemies or to control some domestic issues that they might have had. In the case of Balfour, it was really presented as an element where Chaim Weizmann, I guess, had presented to Balfour a means of gaining the support of the Jewish population in England. So I wonder sometimes if we give too much credit to the Balfour Declaration for causing, being at the crux of the situation in the Middle East, in Palestine, but really oftentimes as an excuse. And the question is, are we doing ourselves a disservice by, in essence, giving it too much credit, and that we're maybe better off, just referring it to it as an expeditious device for political powers at the time?
One more. This is for Rami Huri. I agreed with everything you said about the implications, consequences of the Balfour Declaration, except there's one I didn't understand, which is how did it lead to the practice of Arab military men later taking the tradition now of military men taking power in the Arab nations.
I don't know who would like to field any or all of those, but please be my guest.
Okay, the question of the link between Balfour and everything it represented in terms of Western imperial interventions and playing in our region, playing with us and our people and our lands and our rights, and the military takeovers in the Arab countries, the link is very simple, is that one of the reasons that constantly was used by military leaders in Arab countries, colonels and generals who took power, like Gaddafi, like Nasser, like Assad, like all of them, one of the reasons was that only they could defend the Arab countries, could develop the Arab countries to protect themselves against the threat that Israel and Zionism and Western imperialism represented, and therefore they should rule. And they did rule, and they just took power, and using Palestine as an excuse. They failed in delivering on all of their promises, but there was a very clear, direct link there. They didn't just take power to say that military men are going to bring us education and enlightenment and prosperity. They did say that sometimes, but they didn't achieve any of these things. But Palestine was central to their self-validation as self-imposed, unelected, non-accountable, and it turned out perpetual rulers.
I'd like to relate to are we giving the Balfour Declaration too much credit or putting too much weight on it? I just read recently that there have been 63,000 books written on the Civil War, 63,000. On the Civil War. So there haven't been that many books written on Balfour or even articles. But I think like any political history, you get a lot of information, a lot of data, a lot of analysis. Just recently I read an article about some affair that somebody had with somebody in the British government, and that explains everything, why Balfour said X to Y. All right, so I agree that the political analysis of why Balfour put out that declaration, why the cabinet accepted it, and why Weizmann was so important there. Somebody said because he invented acetone, right? I mean, this again is a point of analysis which might be interesting, but it doesn't give the deep analysis, the deep interpretation of what was going on there. In the case of Balfour, I'd like to say that even if it was just a political exigency, even if it was just a matter of getting the Jews to vote, or not to vote, but to pressure certain governments to go into the war, even if it were these very localized reasons, political reasons, we give it credit because of its aftermath. We give it credit because of how it's been received and what has been done with it. And in that sense, again, I can only speak for Israel. In Israel, it is considered the biggest stepping stone to Israeli national independence, Jewish sovereignty. And in that sense, it was gigantic, even if we don't give it too much credit. That's the credit it got, and it has been used as an excuse, as a reason, as a justification for so many things.
I'll just briefly say, I think that when we look at these documents, also we're looking at them as an outpouring, as the previous panel discussed, if it hadn't been this, it might have been something else, because it was a reflection of larger colonial trends, certainly. But I think the other part of your question that you raised in some senses is about when I was trying to think about what to say, I was thinking, well, we're writing this history and in some ways asking the consequences of Balfour for Palestinians, and looking at the state of Palestinians today. Unfortunately, there was a little bit of a tendency in what I wrote to downplay Palestinian agency also. So there's another thing we can think about is what are the role that Palestinians and Palestinian leadership have had in shaping, the last decades as well. So I think that's another thing to think about and remember. Thanks.
Nancy, do you want to say anything?
No, I would just like to add, in terms of the U.S., it really did give a huge boost to Zionism, and really got organized Zionism motivated. And so for that reason, what we see followed throughout all the debates that followed the Balfour Declaration really did have to do with, is this going to be good for the interests of this country or not? And it's a very, you know, it was up in the air for a while, but without the Balfour Declaration, it's hard to see how that real jump start would have happened. It couldn't have come out of nowhere. It had to come from somewhere, that you would get organized Zionism really on the move.
No, just one more thing. When the Balfour Declaration was incorporated into the mandates that came out of the League of Nations a few years later, that gave it the weight of international law and legitimacy, and we've seen what's happened ever since in the Arab state system.
Great. So please, we'll take maybe, do we have time for 2 more questions? If there is another, but please, Giacomo, go ahead.
So what I was wondering specifically for Rami is is there any hope for the Arab people to sort of, particularly through the Arab Spring, to sort of break the cycle of incompetent military leaders seizing power while also still being able to withstand neocolonialism from the West and Israel?
Excellent question. So we'll take that, and then we'll take another. Thank you. More youth, yes. We need the younger perspectives. Please.
Oh, so I just had a quick question, and it's kind of going off Rami Khouri's description of how the Balfour Declaration would have extended to like Zionism and then the state of Israel. And adding on to what Nancy Murray said, I have a question. Would you argue or like support an idea that a 6th consequence of the Balfour Declaration in its entirety until now and its effects would be almost exposing the United States as not like an angel in the international community and like a nation that's never done any wrong? And would that eventually change how the international community may look at Palestinians or Israelis or the Middle East, in that the U.S. has played a role in every single one of those nations in the Middle East and their conflicts? Would looking at the U.S. as a nation that has actually done maybe wrong things, and for once recognizing like what you could call a genocide against our Native Americans, like would that change how the international community looks at the U.S. intervention in the Middle East?
Thank you. Thank you. So please.
On the question of hope for the future, I think it's inevitable that, yes, one day the fundamental goodness, dignity, and decency of the 400 million Arab people will manifest themselves. There's just no doubt about it. The question is, how will they break through this incredible fortress of autocracy that has been directly supported by global powers? And we're not just talking now about, before it was the West, it was England, France, the US. Now you've got the Russians, you've got the Iranians, you've got other foreign powers coming down to reinforce and solidify, empower autocratic leaderships. We will definitely break through that. What we've seen so far in the uprisings and in many, many other expressions of disgust by ordinary people with their prevailing political and economic and social conditions, we've seen many examples, including negative ones like mass migration, people dropping out of the state system and creating their own powers, going around the incompetency of the state and dealing with their needs through other mechanisms in society. But the uprisings were the most dramatic expression of what people wanted. And what people wanted were a bunch of abstract nouns. They were talking about dignity, about freedom, about I want to live, about social justice. It was very abstract because they were expressing the antidotes to what they were suffering from, which was autocracy, oppression, lack of opportunity, injustice, et cetera, et cetera. Only one country has broken through, Tunisia, and it's still early days, but we're hoping that they will set the example and be the Poland to the Arab world, as Poland broke through in 1980 and then opened up the liberation of much of the former Soviet empire, that Tunisia will be the breakthrough that then ripples across the region. But the forces of autocracy are very strong and very determined, and the Saudis and Emiratis and others in the Arab world are spending billions and billions of dollars to reinforce autocratic regimes, as is the United States and many foreign powers. It's not easy to break through that, but the Vietnamese did it, the Algerians did it, the Indians did it with the British. All imperial powers in the world ultimately were defeated. The Afghans did it with the Soviets. So the Arabs will ultimately achieve their basic goals of simply being allowed to live a normal, decent life. That's all they're asking for. They will achieve it one day, but we can't tell when or how. But what we do know is that there's mass discontent, there's mass vulnerability. 4 out of 5 Arabs can barely meet their monthly basic needs. If you want evidence, go to look at some of the surveys done by the Arab Center in Doha. 78% of Arabs can just barely meet their monthly needs or cannot meet their monthly needs of food, medicine, water, and they have to get charity or steal or beg or borrow or something. So there's just mass vulnerability and tensions. There's 2 million Arabs born every year in Egypt. There's 9 million Arabs born every year across the region. The pressures of population growth combined with autocracy of the Arab governments is leading to increased pressure from above, as you see in Egypt, for instance, and you see it now in the Gulf, the wealthy Gulf states, where you'll be put in prison if you tweet something they don't like. So this is expanding. So this is the short-term movement to suppress the desire for dignity in a normal life by ordinary people, directly managed by most Arab regimes, and directly funded and supported and armed by Western and Eastern powers. So this is the low point that we're experiencing right now, but I can tell you, walking through the Arab world and meeting with ordinary people and professionals and middle-class people, people are fed up with this system, and they will eventually figure out how to come together and change it. There's no doubt in my mind.
Thank you for your question, and I hope we have a time to dialogue at a subsequent time. Because the issue really is complicated about American imperialism. Because on the one hand, post-World War I, you had obvious colonial powers like France and England, and then you had America, which pretended that it wasn't a colonial power. But if you read its own history and you see that it was very much on an imperial trajectory by the late 19th century with its, taking over of the Philippines, its hopping across Hawaii and so on, it was on a colonial trajectory or an imperial trajectory. So, but in 1920s, there was a point where people said, give the mandate to America, not to European colonial powers, because they're different. Well, we pretended to be different, but we weren't. And what's happened now is I think the mask is really off U.S. pretext to be different and to have, more respect for human rights and the rule of law and international law. And until it starts really paying attention to international structures of legality, which it's always shunned, I think, it's going to be the situation we have now, which is when a resolution comes up in the UN, it's like 165 votes to 3. United States, Israel, and something like Nauru or Marshall Islands. Yeah, Micronesia. So are we willing to be in that position in the world? It's like now with Trump on climate change. Are we willing to be the only nation that is not going along? So we have a lot of work to do here to change all of that. Yeah. Should I say something about lunch?
Yes, well, let me first thank you all. What a splendid panel. Help me thank once again the panelists.